Hey, what's good? Welcome to the channel. My name is Troy Mayers. I'm pumped to have you here. If you clicked into this video, it's because you've been endlessly scrolling YouTube, watching just about every video there is that compares the A7 Mark IV to the new Panasonic S5 II or S5 II Mark X, right? And it gets to be a little bit overwhelming because the cameras are very similar with some nuanced differences. And it's like splitting hairs. You almost just want someone to make a decision for you. Well, that was the video I was looking for, so that's the video we're making today. Let's get into it. The reason that these two cameras are so competitively compared one to the other is because they are very similar cameras. They've got a similar price point, with the A7IV being about $500 US more expensive than the Panasonic counterpart. And then from a form factor perspective, we're gonna find even more similarities. They've got a similar size and weight, battery performance, negligible differences between the LCD and the EVF quality. We also have comparable input and output ports and customizable buttons, dials, and wheels, you name it. We start to see a couple differences as we look at the media cards. They both have dual SD card slots, with the A7IV offering one of the slots that can hold CF Express Type A cards, which helps with the read and write speed, as well as the buffering capabilities when taking burst photos. Another difference that we're going to find is in the sensor. The A7IV offers the 33 megapixel sensor compared to the 24 on the S5 II and S5 II Mark X. However, the S5 II Mark X does offer internal cooling, and that's going to be a big deal. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. So it really does become pretty self-evident as to why this is such a hard decision to make. Now, there were a few distinguishing characteristics of each camera body that really just had me stuck. I couldn't make a decision. I'm not proud of this, but I was like losing sleep over not being able to decide which camera body to go with. So having done all the research that you're doing right now, trying to make this decision, I had pretty well decided that the Panasonic S5 II Mark X was going to be my camera. I was going to buy two identical bodies, get the lineup of Lumix S Prime lenses, and I was going to just go to town, right? There's a couple reasons as to why that camera was really drawing me. And as a filmmaker first, who happens to have a nasty photography habit, the S5 II is touted as being more video-centric. One of the main draws for me was shutter angle. The Sony system doesn't offer shutter angle on their hybrid cameras, or I don't believe the FX3 even offers shutter angle, which is their cinema line. So shutter angle was a big deal. I've messed up my shutter speed in the past, switching between different frame rates. So there's a real peace of mind that comes with knowing that you can set your shutter angle at 180 and you're not gonna mess up a shot for that reason anyway. You can mess it up for any number of other reasons, but at least that's not one of them, right? So shutter angle. There also are several other assist features that are found on the S5 II that you're not going to find on the Sony that as a filmmaker are really pretty great. One of them being waveforms. Great for getting the proper exposure, right? It also has probably better IBIS, at least better IBIS out of camera. I shoot a lot of handheld stuff. So those were features that were really pulling me towards the S5 II Mark X. Oh, and the internal cooling. I rely on my cameras to make a living, right? And I need my cameras to work all the time and not overheat on me. So having active cooling was, now that I'm saying it out loud, probably the biggest draw to the S5 II and the S5 II Mark X. But the Sony was not going down without a fight. So here are the things that were keeping me up at night. The first was that 33 megapixel sensor. I've been shooting on the C70 the last couple of years, and that camera is, by design, inherently a bit soft. It's supposed to be more cinematic or film-like, if you will, and that's all good and well. But I've recently been longing for a little bit more sharpness out of my image. So when I watched the sample footage from other great YouTubers out here, I was really drawn to that sharpness and detail resolution. That 4K image that's been downsampled from 7K was really something that I was longing for. So that was one of the hangups as to why I was being pulled towards the Sony camp. The other big one was focus breathing compensation. Focus racks are one of my favorite camera movements out there. And lens breathing puts a real dampener on being able to do those movements. That zoom in, zoom out effect you get gets to be distracting and pulls the viewer out of the story, so I don't get to do them as often as I wanted to. Now I know I could go out and buy cinema lenses, which will optically not have as much focus breathing. They're bigger, heavier, more expensive. There's a time and place for it, but I wanted to be able to utilize the vast amount of Sony EMO stills lenses for my video work because of all the benefits that they offer. So I was really drawn to focus breathing compensation. All right, bear with me for this last one because this one's not necessarily a tangible thing, but it seems like in our creator space, everybody is always comparing new hybrid cameras to the A7IV or the A7S3. There's so many YouTube videos out there that are, does the R6 Mark II take the A7S3 down as the video king? Is this better than the A7 IV? It's like every new camera is held to the standard of the A7 IV or the A7S3. And that was really interesting to me. That was something I had been observing for some time. And it got me asking, why is this camera the standard? What about it that makes it the standard to which every other camera has to go head to head with? So I wanted to find that out for myself, and that was really drawing me to the A7 IV. So after a full working day of talking to my buddy Josh Zerop here in the studio, he finally helped me make a decision so I could move on with my life. He's like, you gotta rent both cameras. Get them in the studio so you can get hands-on experience with them, and then you'll know which one the right camera is for you. It's great advice. So that's what I did. And up to this point in the video, we've been cutting back and forth between the two cameras. And it's been a blind cut, so that way you guys didn't know which camera was which, and maybe you could make your own biased decision as to which image you preferred. But here's the reveal. The A camera angle here has been the Sony A7IV with the 35mm 1.4 G Master Prime lens on it, stopped down to 2.8. Our B cam has been the Lumix S5II with the Lumix S35mm 1.8, stopped down to 2.8 as well. There truly was a defining moment in getting this hands-on experience with both of these cameras. Now keep in mind, I had already pretty well decided that I was going to buy the S5II Mark X, and at this point, I was just going through the motions. So I got both cameras in, opened up the cases, and began to handle them individually. And a little piece of me on the inside knew immediately that the Sony A7 IV was going to be the camera for me. The form factor, the layout, the weight, everything felt right. I felt like I was at home. On the S5II, it felt a little bit cheaper, a little plasticky. I didn't like the S-series lenses quite as much. It felt a little bit foreign and a little bit cold. And I realized that's a very arbitrary and intangible thing to try to communicate in a review. And it's not necessarily a fair spec to judge a camera based on. But the reason I switch cameras as often as I do is because new cameras often evoke new creativity. So I knew in my heart that I wanted the A7 IV, but in my head, the S5IIx was the camera for me. So what do? You put them to the test anyway, and it became quickly self-evident why the Sony is the standard as to which so many other cameras are compared to. The Sony's had multiple iterations and generations of cameras to refine the layout, the menu system, the interface, the autofocus performance, all these quality of life things that creators like us have been able to give feedback to and create the newer cameras that we have now. The S5II is a little bit earlier stages, right? And some of those things began to show. For example, the autofocus performance. We do now have face and eye detect autofocus on the S5II, and that was going to be awesome. And I think it very well could be with future firmware updates. But like I said, it is the first iteration of face and eye detect autofocus. So there were some quirks that came with that, and it wasn't as reliable as I wanted it to be, especially because I wear a lot of hats, and that was just kind of throwing things off. Even the first time I tried using it, it was just not something that I felt rock solid confident in, and that began to deflate my intrigue in the S5II. There were a couple other quirks that I didn't particularly like. The two cameras have very similar input and output ports, but the placement of those ports is actually a really big deal. The A7 IV system has the 3.5mm jack as well as the HDMI jack completely out of the way of the flipped LCD screen. That's something that takes a couple generations to get figured out and get right. On the S5II, the HDMI port and 3.5 port get in the way of the flip screen. And I know you're sitting there thinking, that's not a big deal, I can work around that, and you're absolutely right, you can. But using them side by side, the A7 IV's port layout was a real quality of life improvement that I want you to be aware of that you're sacrificing with the S5II. One other quirk that I want to knock the S5 II for was one of the control dials on the top of the camera is positioned on the very outer right edge of the camera. And other reviewers have said this before, it's very easy to bump that dial. And I'm here to confirm that is very much the case, and that was a real concern of mine. One of my biggest concerns with the Sony was going to be overheating. I use my cameras professionally to make a living. I couldn't have overheating. I needed to test that for myself. And having done so, I feel confident that I can trust this camera moving forward. There is always going to be a little piece of me that's a little bit concerned that this camera will overheat at the worst possible time, but in my testing so far, it has not overheated on me, and I'm gonna move forward with that system. One other aspect of the Sony system, as I was looking into a little bit further, I wanted you to be aware of, was the ecosystem. The Sony is the standard as far as hybrid cameras go, and as a result, there's a lot more aftermarket support for that camera system, whether it's cages or mics or straps or underwater housing, weird third-party lenses, you name it. Because the Sony is the more popular camera system, it's going to command more attention from the aftermarket and third-party manufacturers. So you're gonna have more options for how you want to use and rig up your camera. So that's something worth knowing. So if you've watched at least 10 other review videos trying to figure out which one of these cameras to go with, buy the A7IV. Thank you for watching. Happy shooting and God bless.